This was a tiny aspect of an elaborate and detailed investigation of the feminine mystique, a scrupulous weighing of evidence and comparing of notes. I would love to be able to give the impression that it was a relationship between equals, but if represented in cartoon form, the true picture would be closer to one of those great white sharks that evolution has fitted out with an accompanying but rather smaller fish. I would turn up at parties with Martin, to be sure, but with the rather resigned attitude. At one soiree in Holland Park, he was introduced to a young woman, with a result that was as close as made no difference to witnessing a lightning strike or a thunderbolt. His then girlfriend was present at the party, as I think was the other young lady's husband. But when that happened in the adjoining room was unstoppable and seemed somehow foreordained. We both knew that the subsequent pregnancy was almost certainly also a consequent one, but so gentlemanly was the husband in the case that it was not until 2 decades later that Martin received the letter from his missing daughter, the lovely Delilah Seal, his bonding with whom, there doesn't seem to be another word for it, is one of the most affecting things I have ever chanced to see. And she, the offspring of that thunderbolt moment, has now become the mother of Martin's first grandchild, another thought that gives me a reflective but piercingly sweet pang. Pasternak was perhaps not such a fool when he wrote in Dr. Savango that all conceptions are immaculate. I could tell that Martin was fitted for glory in work as well as life, and when the Rachel Papers was a huge critical and commercial grand slam, I sent him a long telegram. It was a stave from F. Scott Fitzgerald's early success. Of course, in some ways, this was inappropriate. Scotty burned out and died at 44 and is buried along with poor Mad Zelda not far from me in Rockville, Maryland. But to us then, the age of 40 lay well over the horizon. It wasn't really true of Martin, as Fitzgerald had put it, that premature success gives one an almost mystical conception of destiny as opposed to willpower. At its worst, the Napoleonic delusion. However, there was a paragraph that did seem to meet the case, and this I sent him. The compensation of a very early success is a conviction that life is a romantic matter. In the best sense, one stays young. When the primary objects of love and money could be taken for granted, and a shaky eminence had lost its fascination. I had fair years to waste, years that I can't honestly say I regret, in seeking the eternal carnival by the sea. Over the course of the next several years, we were still able to indulge in creative time-wasting by talking, always with ardent respect, but always exhaustively, and until there was absolutely nothing left to say. About women, different women, and sometimes the same woman. I remember being rather relieved when, one of those women, it could be said that it was I who had featured with her, so to speak, first. It seemed only fair, and then the talk would turn to other things. Martin never let friendship take precedence over his first love, which was and is the English language. If one employed a lazy or stale phrase, it would be rubbed in. There, I have done it again. No, it would be incisively emphasized, with a curl of that mighty lip and ironic gesture. If one committed the offense in print, I remember once saying, "No mean achievement," in an article. The rebuke might come in note form, or by one's being handed a copy of the article with a penciled underlining. He could take this vigilance to almost parodic lengths. The words "ruggedly handsome features" appear on the first page of 1984, and for a while Martin declined to go any further into the book. The man can't write worth a damn. He was later to admit that the novel did improve and a trifle after that. Years later, when I gave him the manuscript of my book on Orwell, he brought it to our next rendezvous at a Manhattan bistro and wordlessly handed it back. He had gone through it page by page, painstakingly, correcting my pepper shaker punctuation. He seemed to have read everything, and he had the rare faculty of being able to quote longish staves of prose from memory. A passage about Sir Leicester Dedlock and gout from Bleak House, a spine-tingling rendition of Humbert's last verbal duel with Quilty, a paragraph or two about Alexander Portnoy's mother, the latter perhaps not so astonishing now that I think about it. In his work as well as in his life, Martin has done the really hard thinking about hand jobs and put us all very sincerely and gratefully in his debt. In this area, too, I felt myself the junior. It was he who got me to read Nabokov, and to do so with care as well as with awe, if only because I knew I would be asked questions. However, I was able to return the favor in a way which was to help change his life in turn, by pressing on him a copy of Humboldt's Gift. Loved by women, while also being adored by men, shall I say, no mean achievement? Martin also has a way of attracting fathers. He once went to meet John Updike at the Massachusetts General Hospital, and told me that when he had said goodbye, had felt oddly as if waving farewell to a male parent. I happened to be interviewing John Updike a year or so later, and mentioned that I knew this great admirer, the younger Ami. With an extraordinarily gentle expression on his face, Updike recalled the meeting at Mass Gen, and said it was the strangest thing watching him walk away, almost as if he were my son. And nobody who has read Martin on Saul Bellow, let alone seen him in the company of the old man, can doubt for a second that this combination of admiring and protective feelings had eventually become fiercely filial. He said indignantly to me, when I gave Bellow's Ravelstein's slightly disobliging review, "Don't cheek your elders." I waited for something else, some hint of the ironic, perhaps, but with perfectly emphatic gravity, he repeated the admonition. This from the one infant terrible could mean only one thing. But I was also lucky in meeting Martin when his relationship with his true father was at its absolute best. I remember envying the way in which the two of them could tell jokes without inhibition, discuss matters sexual, and compete only over minor differences about literature or politics. There had once been a bad time when Martin and his siblings, and his mother, had been abandoned by the old man, and there was to come a moment when that same old man metamorphosed into an elderly man, querulous and paranoid and devoid of wit. But in between there was a wonderful golden late summer. "Dad, will you make some of your noises?" It was easy to see, when this invitation was taken up, where Martin had acquired his own gift for mimicry. Kingsley could do the sound of a brass band approaching on a foggy day. He could become the Metropolitan line train entering Edgware Road Station. He could be 4 wrecked tramps coughing in a bus shelter. This was very demanding, and once led to heart palpitations. To create the hiss and crackle of a wartime radio broadcast delivered by Franklin Delano Roosevelt was for him scant problem. A tape of it, indeed, was played at his memorial meeting, where I was hugely honored to be among the speakers. The piece de resistance, an attempt by British soldiers to start up a frozen 2-ton truck on a windy morning somewhere in Germany, was for special occasions only. One held one's breath as Kingsley emitted the first screech of the busted starting key. His only slightly lesser vocal achievement, of a motorbike yelling in mechanical agony, once caused a man who had just parked his own machine in the street to turn back anxiously and take a look. The old boy's imitation of an angry dog barking the words "fuck off" was note perfect. Evenings at his home in Flask Walk, the perfect address, were of Falstaffian proportions, with bulging sacks of takeaway food and continual raids on the rightly vaunted arsenal of his cellar. "Hitch," he said to me once, "you've been here before, and you know the rule of the house. If you don't have a drink in your hand, it's your own fault." Noises might or might not be part of the entertainment. He had a tendency to the gross and evidently thought that a belch, say, was a terrible thing to waste. I remember his unscripted trombonings and trumpetings, his cigars and his Macallan's single malt, his limericks and his charades, just as I remember sitting quietly while he talked, with authority about why Jane Austen was not all that good. The word "good" in all variations, see the blues in the footnote preceding, was almost all that this man of immense vocabulary required as a shorthand critical tool. I don't know whether the concept hailed from the Newspeak Dictionary in 1984, where the choices range from plus good to double plus and good, but bloody good from Kingsley was authoritatively affirmative. Good was really pretty good. Some good wasn't all bad. No good was applied very scathingly indeed. And 3-sentence, 6-word pronouncement which I had heard him render upon Graham Greene's then latest novel, The Human Factor, absolutely no bloody good at all, was conclusive. I shall try and be brief about the sorry way in which things ended up after I left for America. Kingsley wrote a novel called Stanley and the Women. This failed to get published in New York, and the word reached me that objections from feminists had prevented it from getting adopted by any major house. There were also those who claimed to find it anti-Semitic, though the only offensive remarks in its pages were made by a young man who was clearly out of his mind. I launched a campaign in my column in the Times Literary Supplement against what was just then becoming widely known as political correctness. I kept on being boring about this, until eventually I received a letter from an editor, a Jewish woman as it happened, who said, in effect, "Okay, you win. We'll save the honor of publishing by doing Stanley." Kingsley, with whom I hadn't seen for years, invited me to a celebration of this small victory on my next visit to London. We were to meet at the Garrick Club, be joined by Martin, see a movie, and then have a lavish dinner. I still shrink from recalling it. As soon as I arrived at the Garrick's bar, he told me a joke I'd heard before, and could obviously see that it hadn't worked. His choice of film was an Eddie Murphy insult that seemed to contradict his increasing contempt for American culture. He appeared genuinely offended that we thought so little of it. Martin and I kept nervously behaving, as if he must somehow be joking. Flawless masterpiece, he kept energetically insisting. And this was a mistake. Not only was he not joking, he was in every other way failing to be amused. In an alarming reversal of his earlier Falstaffianism, he also managed to look both corpulent and resentful. Surfeit swelled, to be sure, but quite without mirth. I think he may have managed one of his riffs about Nelson Mandela being a terrorist. Most painful of all, and somehow rendering rather pointless the original point of the evening, he had abandoned his old liking of the United States and passed the test of the true reactionary by becoming sulphurous anti-American. Every modern American novelist, he ended up by telling Martin once, and subverting my defense of him, is either a Jew or a hick. I was never to see Kingers again, and when I was almost the only person given kindly treatment in his notorious memoirs, felt oddly discriminated against. That last evening of ours was the very definition of having no fun. We were no longer drawing on a common store of comic gags and literary allusions. I boldly assert, in fact, I think I know, that a lot of friendships and connections absolutely depend upon a sort of shared language or slang. Not necessarily designed to exclude others, these can establish a certain comedy and, even after a long absence, re-establish it in a second. Martin is a genius at this sort of thing. It arises from his willingness to devote real time to the pitiless search for the apt resonance. I don't know quite why this lodges in my mind, but we once went to some grand black tie ball that had been slightly over-advertised and proved disappointing. The following morning he rang me. I found the way to describe the men at the horror show last evening. Tuxed fucks. As this will illustrate, he did not scorn the demotic, or the American. In fact, he remains almost unique in that way that he can blend pub talk and mid-Atlantic idiom into paragraphs and pages that are also fully aware of Milton and Shakespeare. I am morally certain that it's this combination of the classical, with the wised-up and street-smart, most conspicuously with Augie March, that made it a sure thing that he and Saul Bellow would one day take each other's hands. Martin had a period of relishing the Boston thug writer George V. Higgins, author of The Friends of Eddie Coyle. Higgins' characters had an infectious way of saying "inna" and "onna," so Martin would say, for example, "I think this lunch should be on a hitch," or "I heard he wasn't that useful in a sack." Simple pleasures, you might say, but linguistic sinew is acquired in this fashion, and he would not dump a trope until he had chewed all the flesh and pulp off of it, and was left only with pit and pips. Thus there arrived a day when Park Lane played host to a fancy new American hotel with the no less fancy name of the Inn on the Park, and he suggested a high-priced cocktail there for no better reason than that he could instruct the cab driver to park in a inn on a park. This near palindrome, as I now think of it, gave us much innocent pleasure. Not all of our pleasures were innocent. There came a day when we were both in New York, and both beginning to feel the long, strong, gravitational pull of the great American planet, but where a slight chore meanwhile required itself to be performed. In the midterm churnings of what was to become his breakout novel Money, Martin required his character to visit a brothel, or bordello. He even had one all picked out for us. Its front name was the Tahitian, a dire Polynesian-themed massage parlor, on Lower Lexington Avenue, and you, he informed me, are fucking well coming with me. I wanted to say something girlish like, have I ever refused you anything? But instead settled for something rather more masculine like, do we know the form at this joint? I could not possibly have felt less like any such expedition. I had a paint-stripping hangover and a sour mouth, and he had that look of set purpose on his face that I well knew. And I also knew I could not be gainsaid. How bad could it be? Pretty damn bad, as it turned out. One of the numerous, regrettable elements that go to make up the unlawful carnal knowledge industry, I should single out for distinction the look of undisguised contempt that is often worn on the faces of the female staff. Some of the working hostesses may have to simulate delight or even interest, itself a pretty cock-shriveling thought. But when these same ladies do the negotiating, they can shrug off the fake charm as a snake discards an unwanted skin. I suppose they know or presume that they have already got the despised male client exactly where they want him. As it happens, this wasn't true in our case. I would gladly have paid not to have sex at this point, and Martin needed only to snap his fingers in order to enjoy female company. But the cynical little witches at the Tahitian were not to know that they were being conscripted into the service of literature. It was well said by John Terrell in The Plague, I think that attendance at lectures in an unknown language will help to hone one's awareness of the exceedingly slow passage of time. I once had the experience of being waterboarded, and can now dimly appreciate how much every second counts in the experience of the torture victim, forced to go on enduring what is unendurable. But not even the lapse of time between then and now has numbed my recollection of how truly horrible it was to be faking interest in someone who was being paid, and paid rather more, incidentally, than I could afford. To feign a contemptuous interest in me. The multiplier effect of this mutual degradation gave me dry heaves and flop sweats, and I began to fear, conveyed the entire misleading impression of my being a customer who was convulsed by the hectic sickness of lust. The seconds went limping and dragging by on absolutely leaden feet. It was the cash question, though, that saved me. With some presence of mind, I had for once preempted Martin in the bar of the dump, where the gruesome selection process began, by swiftly pointing to the prettiest and slenderest of those available, who also possessed one of the most vicious-looking smiles I have ever seen on a human face. Once removed to her sinister cubicle, we commenced to bargain. Or rather, in a sort of squalid reverse haggle. Every time I agreed to the price, she added some tax or impost or surcharge and bid me higher. Clad by now only in some sort of exegious sarong, and equipped only with a dank Ziploc bag containing my credit cards and money, one was obliged to check everything else before entering the humid bar. I warily started to count out the ever-steepening fee, which was the only thing in the room that showed any sign of enlarging itself. It turned out that, with the tips and percentages and whatnot, the avaricious bitch had contrived a figure that was not just more than I could afford, but more than I had on me. I was down to the quarters and nickels, and it showed. She had, I will say for her, more pride than that. A handful of change thrown in? No one can be expected to take this. So I took her cue of rage and stood up with about as much self-esteem as I could wrap around myself. There was a two-faced coin of luck. I not only didn't have to go through with it, but I didn't have to shell out the dough either. I lurked torpidly in the recovery room, or whatever they call it, and was eventually joined by a rather reduced and chastened Martin. If you want to know what happened to him, the whole experience enriched and enhanced by what I confessed to him of what had happened to me, you must read pages 98 through 104 of the Penguin edition of Money, where John Self tries to get laid for pay under the bam under the boo at a perfectly foul establishment named the Happy Isles. There are many, many reasons why Money is a great English novel of the 1980s, to which I am able to add this ensuing insight. Out of our grim little encounter, where he, poor bastard, actually had to part with cash and endure a sexual fiasco, came several paragraphs of pure, reality-based fantasy that make me twist and snarl with laughter every time. And no, you most definitely did not have to have been there. We went off to recuperate at a lunch with Jane Bonham Carter and Ian Lafresnius, at which I remember using hot Japanese sake, by no means for the first time, as an expedient solvent for my still clinging hangover. Seldom can a mid-morning have been so ill-spent, yet, which perhaps goes to show, seldom can such rank dissipation have yielded so many dividends on the page. In all of Martin's fiction, one finds the same keen relish for and appreciation of the multiple uses of embarrassment. The bite of his wit redeems this form being mere farce or humiliation. When fused with his high seriousness about language, the effect is truly formidable. He once rebuked some pedantic antagonist by saying that the man lacked any sense of humor, but added that by this accusation he really intended to impugn his want of seriousness. In a completely other incarceration, I have often thought that he would have made a terrifying barrister. Once decided on mastering a brief, whether it be in his work on nuclear weapons, the final solution, or the Gulag, he would go off and positively saturate himself in the literature, and you could always tell there was a work in progress when all this conversation began to orient itself into the master theme. In this he strangely resembled Perry Anderson, the theoretician of New Left Review, with whom I also became friendly at about this time. Perry's